Thank you very much, Diana. I also wanted to thank Marlene and Lilia for inviting me and organizing the event. I'm going to be dealing with, as Diana said, Ilyas Esenberlin's Kōşpendiler today. And this was a text that he originally published in 3 volumes from 1969 to 1973, before issuing it as a single sort of mammoth novelistic trilogy in 1976. And Kōşpendiler, or the Nomads, was Esenberlin's masterwork. It was the product of 20 years of research and investigation into archives and documents in libraries in Orenburg and Omsk and Almaty. And it was part of his effort to try and collect and identify and precisely name every past, people, plant, animal, or tradition that existed in the Eurasian steppe. And the basic element I'm going to be talking about today is probably about half the paper. I gave you guys a bit of a monster, so I'm going to try and condense at least part of it. And I'm going to be looking at Esenberlin's work as a reflection on what it meant to be classified, labeled, named, and marked on a map. And Esenberlin was very aware that his heritage had been classified and labeled in Soviet era and imperial era experiments. And many of the Russian generals in the novel that he writes, the men who had expeditions into the steppes, are also ethnographers and have at their disposal exhaustive lists of plants and birds, tribal maps, extensive collections of tribal genealogies and oral legends. They are people armed with classifications and paper. And the basic idea is that Esenberlin's Kōşpendiler was written with this inheritance of paper on his mind. It was his attempt to come to terms with this legacy of classification. And in order to try and make this a bit more accessible, or at least to explain why this was interesting to me, I wanted to tell you a bit of an anecdote. A couple of years ago, I reread an article by Yuri Slowskin that's in Russia's Orient called Nations versus Naturalists. And in this article, Slowskin had made the argument that European nationalists from the European academies had come to the Russian state in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and brought with them an arsenal designed for the classification of birds and plants and animals and landscapes. And that over time, this arsenal was retooled or redesigned to make sense of human difference. Or in other words, that the classification of plants and animals and birds over time became the classification of peoples, tribes, ethnographies in the Russian imperial state. And that was Slowskin's argument. And about the same time that I read this, I came across a strange entry in the Kazakh Soviet Encyclopedia, in the, I believe it's the 11th or 12th volume of the Kazakh Soviet Encyclopedia, which was published in 1976. And it was an article on what was called the Sak anthropological type, the Scythian anthropological type. And the Scythians are a nomadic people that existed in 3 to 4 century BC. And the Kazakhs consider them to be one of the primary sort of stratum of their ethnic identity. And this encapsulation included very elaborate measurements of eye structure, of the cranium, of the foreheads, of the wingspan of the Scythians. And what I found particularly surprising, that right before it, there was a very elaborate anthropological, not an anthropological classification, but a naturalistic classification of a fish, the sak baluk, or the Scythian fish. And that right after it, there was another classification of an animal, the sakulda kikulduk, or the bearded partridge. And it seemed to me that this sort of chance encounter of these 3 things, you have a Scythian anthropological type, considered to be at the center of Kazakh ethnic identity, bookended on one side by a classification of a fish, and bookended on another by a classification of a partridge, seemed to be an example of what Slowskin was pointing to in his article. The idea that at some point, these classificatory practices that have been developed to make sense of and put in order the immense confusion of the natural world had been pointed towards making sense of human difference, diversity, and complexity. And I went and looked in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia to see if there was anything similar. And there's no mention of the same anthropological types. But if you look at each of the titular republic entries, you will see a series of sort of textual exhibits that take you through the botany, the flora, the fauna, the geology, and the geography of each of these countries, or each of these geographies before they go into these very expansive ethnogenetic surveys and histories. And the impression it leaves you is that you're being taken through this textual museum of these very established or considered established fields of science. And then you get to ethnicity, which is elevated to the same plane. And the reason that I'm talking about all of this in the context of Kōşpendiler is that I think that his work, or at least the portions of it I'm going to focus on, was his attempt to come to terms with the genealogy of this present, and to come to terms with this empire of paper and taxonomies and classifications that surrounded him. That his work was geared towards making sense of the sediment of classifications in the steppe across which the Kazakh SSR sprawled, and this was a landscape that was layered with ethnographic, linguistic, and botanical categorizations. So he wrote his work with this inheritance in mind and to try to make sense of it. And the parts of Kōşpendiler that I focus on are the concluding sections, about the last 150 pages of the work. And that particular part of the work focuses on Orenburg in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And it focuses in particular on the efforts of two individuals, Governor General Vasily Perovsky, who was the commandant of Orenburg at this time, and Grigory Fedorovich Gen, who is the chairman of the Orenburg Border Commission. And it deals with their efforts to try and undermine and end the rebellion of the Kazakh Khan Kenesari, who would eventually be stopped and put down in 1847. But as I read these last chapters, I was struck by the variety of names that kept coming up, including Vladimir Dahl. And Dahl was a Russian physician who wrote a massive 4-volume dictionary of the Russian language, in addition to compiling massive insect collections in the steppe, zoological collections in the steppe, writing learned treatises on natural history. He also did zoological and cartographic expeditions at the same time that he was doing all of these things. And Dahl was not an aberration here. Esenberlin made mention of all kinds of figures like this, including Zdenov Velyaminov, who was a prominent Orientalist, and he had written all kinds of works on the importance and significance of Turkic dialects. In Turkestan, he had uncovered an old Chagatai Turkish dictionary, and he had written these extremely detailed encapsulations of monuments, of artifacts, and things like this in Turkestan. You also had individuals like Thomas Jan, who was a displaced Polish exile, and who ended up in charge of the Orenburg Museum. And he would make these massive collections of rocks, flora, and fauna, and try and organize all of these things in Orenburg. And Esenberlin put all of these figures into his novel. He described a relationship between them and Perovsky and Gens, in which they made available their encyclopedic knowledge for the benefit of their rule. So the way that they are imagined in Kōşpendiler is that Perovsky and Gens had at their disposal the encyclopedic knowledge of men like Vladimir Dahl, of men like Zdenov Velyaminov, of men like Thomas Jan. That they were, Perovsky and Gens were individuals armed with encyclopedic knowledge and armed with classifications. And much of this last 100 pages has to do with Esenberlin's attempt to understand what all of this meant for his heritage. And a lot of this last part of the work unfolds as Perovsky and Gens stand in front of this huge map, and they decide how they're going to try and defeat Kenesari Khan. And the way that they decide to defeat them, or the way that Esenberlin says that they defeat them, is through their encyclopedic and classificatory knowledge. They have a microscopic understanding of the Kazakh landscape. They know which plants, which animals feed where, and they can look at a map and know Kenesari will go here because there is abundant game and resources in flora, and he will not go there because those landscapes are burnt out. You will also know that you can look at specific wells on the steppe and know which ones are infested with bacteria and which ones are not. And so the impression that you get in Kōşpendiler is of two men who are able to sort of defeat Kenesari's rebellion in advance with the aid of the encyclopedic knowledge that they possess. And so the downfall of Kenessari Han and Kōşpendiler is engineered by men armed with taxonomies and classifications, and they basically pull down his rule or pull down his rebellion through using this sort of inheritance of paper and all of these paper instruments. And to me, this is Esenberlin's reflection on sort of the danger of these classifications, what it could do. And it is an extraordinary critique if you look at it in the context of the late Soviet era, looking at a colonial situation like this and depicting it in such a negative way. But the other point that I want to make about the paper, and the other thing I'm trying to take a look at, is that Esenberlin's work wasn't just a reflection on this. It wasn't just an imagination of it. It was a complex, indeterminate reflection of what it was studying in. And by that I mean that Esenberlin's art was addressed to a labyrinthine accumulation of text, that it simultaneously imagined and mirrored, and that it mimicked and reproduced the very things that it critiqued and challenged. And if you look at the whole 1,000 pages of Kōşpendiler, it is a monument of minute ethnographic and historical detail, page after page of minute listings of plants, of animals, of Hans, of peoples, of landscapes. It never ends. And it's just at every page. And if you look at the characteristics that define men, like Vladimir Dahl, that define men like Zerno Velyaminov, it was the same obsession with minute detail. The classificatory tradition, the taxonomic tradition, at least as it was transmitted through the imperial era, was focused on, required, and demanded the accumulation of minute detail in order to create knowledge. And this accumulation of minute detail also involved certain presumptions about their instruments of representation and their relationship to reality. And what I mean by that is that they assumed that you could collect the world in its most minute details, write them down in a book, and have those things accurately reflect the world. They believed in that their instruments of representation could mirror reality precisely. There was no sense that there was a disjunction between words and things. They believed that you could take these devices and accurately measure and map the world. And what I noticed when I read Esenberlin is that however much he could understand and see what it meant to be an object of imperial knowledge, he also seemed to believe wholeheartedly in the idea that you could write down the entirety of a person's inheritance in a book and have it accurately mirror or reflect reality. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But if you look at the way that Esenberlin portrays Gens and Perovsky in their office when they're taking apart Kenessari's rebellion, there is never any confusion or any disjuncture between the words and the things that they represent in that room, the careful collation of words and maps and things in the world. There isn't any separation between them. There isn't any disjuncture between words and what is represented. You can look at a map and know the world, or you can look at the things written down in the text and know that that's what the world is going to look like. And Esenberlin believed in this kind of microscopically accurate ethnographic description of reality, that you could write down the world in a book and have that book look like the world. And so, in a sense, Esenberlin's work was a very stinging, insightful, imaginative critique of what Soviet power was, not Soviet power was, but what imperial power was in the place of taxonomies and classification and knowledge, all of those things in it. But it was also a reflection of it. It mirrored what it was attempting to critique and attack. How much time do I have? Okay. The other part of the book deals a bit with Shokan Valikhanov. And Esenberlin, as he was coming to terms with the men in Orenburg, also created a fictionalized version of Valikhanov. And Valikhanov is sort of famed in Kazakhstan as an indigenous collector or an indigenous collector of all things Kazakh, I guess you could say. And in this era in particular, in the late Soviet era, there was several attempts to lionize him, to reconstruct all of his reconstructions of the Kazakh past, to write down all of his classifications, to copy them from one book to another. And Esenberlin portrayed Valikhanov very much in his own mold. He described him as somebody who was trying to write down the Kazakh inheritance on a piece of paper in order to preserve words that had only ever before been spoken. And he presented him in his own image of what he was trying to do, which is write down the world in the Kazakh language. And for me, this effort on the part of Esenberlin reflected not so much Valikhanov, but the world Esenberlin came from. A world that was overrun with ethnographic knowledge, a world that was layered with competing classifications in which ethnic categorizations were dense and thick and numerous and multiple. And that what he did was take Valikhanov's work, which was in a lot of ways very uncertain. If you go back through and look at Valikhanov's notebooks, he'll have these pages and pages where he has no trouble defining and classifying birds and plants, but when it gets to people, he has quite a bit of difficulty because he knows that those instruments haven't really been retooled yet to fit ethnographic realities. He struggles with them. Esenberlin really didn't have those same struggles. He believed that you could accurately map the ethnographic differences in the world. He believed that you could take the immense differences and diversities of people in the world and divide them up justly. He believed that ethnographic differences and ethnic differences were realities, and he believed that you could study them and write them and reflect on them. Valikhanov had been far more indeterminate in his beliefs. And so when Esenberlin portrayed him in his novel, he didn't so much reconstruct him as alter his knowledge, changing a body of erudition that was not so neatly confined to ethnic categories and that was far less certain in its ability to apportion ethnic difference. I'll try and end here by talking a little bit about where I see this place of this work. This is part of a larger effort, at least on my part, to try and look at Kazakh authors and authors in late Soviet Kazakhstan and their attempts to come to terms with classification. And Esenberlin's writings on this weren't unique, and there were a lot of writers who tried to deal with these same issues. Anwar Alamjanov, for example, his essays are filled with reflections on the same sort of individuals in the imperial era. And he would go through and go through those works and annotate them, take the parts that he liked and incorporate them into his art, and criticize others where he felt that they had sort of mismatched words in Kazakh things. And even somebody like Yuri Dombrovsky, who was a displaced exile in Kazakhstan, would write a book in 1964 called The Keeper of Antiquities. And this was all about what it meant to classify the world. And for Dombrovsky, there was no relationship between words and things. He would go through all these books and try and situate objects in the Kazakh Museum, and nothing ever fit. But they were still dealing with the same language. They were dealing with a world in which classifications were sedimented, they were ingrained and layered, and they were trying to come to terms with them. And that's the basic thing I'm trying to get at in this, is to look at the literary imagination of the classifications that had accumulated in Kazakhstan. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you.